I want to talk to Kieran about his latest article, and it's called Asperger Syndrome, What's in a Name? And he talks about the Asperger's diagnosis that was introduced to, I think, the DSM in 1993, maybe.
Yeah.
And it's already gone from the DSM, and it's on its way out from the ICD as well.
Yeah.
And he talks about, he goes into the history of Asperger in the article. He goes into the history with Connor, Lorna Wing. He talks about the controversy of whether Asperger was a Nazi, was he not a Nazi sympathizer? And then he says, like, none of that matters. And that none of those things are the problem with the Asperger's diagnosis. So can you tell me and tell us what are your issues with Asperger's diagnosis?
Where do I start? Yeah, that's the thing, because what actually sparked it off, I get asked the question all the time, because people with an Asperger's diagnosis, often they go on social media and they get jumped on for calling themselves Aspies, or, saying I have Asperger's or whatever. And so I get asked all the time, why is this happening to me? What's the problem? What's going on? And I've had the privilege of kind of floating around the autistic community for the last 10, 20 years. So, I've seen the evolution of kind of things. And basically the issue is that the Asperger's diagnosis was born out of need, but it was unnecessary need. Because at the time, back in the kind of early 80s, Lorna Wing, who was a psychologist and researcher over here, she was commissioned to go, and people that have read Steve's book will know this bit. She was commissioned to go and find autistic children in a certain area of London. And she did, but they weren't autistic children that could be diagnosed under the criteria that existed then. So there was lots of work put in. Could we expand the criteria? Could we open it up, make it broader? And it didn't happen. They were very protective of what autism was back then. So it took a few years, but she met with Uta Thrift, who was a German researcher living in London, who had translated Asperger's work. So she, Lorna Wing, and Judith Gold came up with a concept of Asperger's syndrome based on part of Hans Asperger's works, a small part of Hans Asperger's work.
She came up with the spectrum.
The spectrum right? As well, yeah, which again was based on part of what Hans Asperger kind of came up with himself. Basically the idea that, there are lots of different people that present in lots of different ways. So that's where the diagnosis came from. But the only clinical difference between Asperger's and autism is the ability to speak at the right time, in inverted commas. That's it. So if you had, I don't know, an 8-year-old child who was given an Asperger's diagnosis, that meant that they could speak, or they spoke early. But then if you had someone who had been given an autism diagnosis who then could speak fully by the age of 8, there's no difference between the two children, but they have a completely different label. And wrapped around that, because of the kind of social and cultural understanding of intelligence and, based on IQ tests, which is just all a load of guff and rubbish, and racist at heart as well in its terms of its history, there's an association with, if you are verbal and able to speak, then you're intelligent. If you are unable to speak, you are unintelligent. So that's where, that's where it comes into functioning labels and things like that. But that's basically where Asperger's became socially a functioning label. So if someone was given Asperger's diagnosis, it's assumed that they don't have any other needs. They don't have, they don't need supported. They're absolutely fine. They're able to function. They're able to go out and do this, whatever everybody else can do. It often means that co-occurring conditions weren't explored, because, Asperger's was an umbrella term, as autism was an umbrella term. And but obviously people who had an Asperger's diagnosis did not all able to go out into society and function fully. So, so it created an expectation on people that actually shouldn't have existed. And also what happened there as well. Sorry, go on.
Is that why the DSM took Asperger's out and created more of like not a functioning level, but a need for levels of support instead? Is that why?
Yeah. Yeah, effectively. I mean, there's been lots of lobbying for a lot of years about removing it and folding everything into one thing, because the problem is with the spectrum is that when Lorna Wing kind of visualized it and how it became understood culturally and socially was this kind of linear straight line where you were at a fixed point where your diagnosis is, starting with low functioning or severe autism, PDD, NOS, and Kanner's autism in the middle, and classic autism, and then Asperger's and high functioning autism at the other end, which in reality just does not work, because, you know, like everybody, we feel differently with every day. We face different challenges. You know, sometimes we burn out, sometimes we're flying, and we move around this space all the time. So you can't have a linear line. So yeah, so that's why it was all kind of folded in under one thing. And I still don't really agree with the number levels and things, because it's still function levels to a degree. But, you know, obviously in medicalized terms, they feel that there's a need for this differentiation. So that's kind of the least worst thing that they could kind of come up with.
And it doesn't even go into things like you talk about, like apraxia, other co-occurring conditions that most doctors, if you have apraxia of speech, they'll just say, oh, well, that's just part of the autism diagnosis. When
it's not. It's a standalone condition. You don't even have to be autistic to have apraxia of speech.
Right.
So, you know, this is the problem. This is the whole problem with the autism narrative. And this is essentially the point that I kind of got to with that article. And it's stuff I talk about all the time, is that there are so many things that go into being autistic, but there's only one real fundamental thing that anybody needs to know, is that it's neurology. It's the process. It's, you know, all of us exist in a world that is brimming with sensory information, and that's how we move through the world, by processing it. We take it in, we process that information, and then we have output, we react to it. And for autistic people, we tend not to have the filters that non-autistic people. This is very simplistic, obviously, but we have less filters. So we're taking in and cognitively processing more information than non-autistic people, which means that we're working harder to do so. And then when you add in all these co-occurring conditions, it causes a whole world of problems all over the place. But lots of those co-occurring conditions are actually things that can be supported. But because it's all lumped under the umbrella of autism as an umbrella term, those things are never investigated, they're never supported, and then it just becomes, oh, that's just part of autism. Like even things like depression and stuff like that. It's now in the UK, at least, there's no adult support for autistics who are depressed, because it's assumed that depression is part of being autistic, which is ridiculous.
Right.
Absolutely ridiculous. But that's how it stands. And all these labels, that's kind of how it's that's kind of where it's driven us to. So that's why I'm you know, people who have that Asperger's diagnosis, you know, for a lot of them, for me at the time when I was diagnosed, that was my diagnostic label. It's answers to questions. You know, you have all these questions, you don't understand what's going on, and then someone gives you a word which answers those questions. But if that word then has been created and used in a way which is divisive, which it was, then it causes a whole world of problems. And because, you know, it's a good thing for me that the label is going, but obviously if people want to keep hold of that identity, that's absolutely fine and valid. But this is an answer as to why they're getting jumped on, effectively.
Thank you for that. I mean, so it's basically what you're saying is, there in the article and now what you're saying is basically it's an arbitrary line between Asperger's and autism, and that line is speaking on time or not speaking on time. And that's it. And that's the only difference. But it kind of had a multiplier effect in our social understanding about autism that, I mean, it was never written, but those with Asperger's or that had the Asperger's diagnosis were somehow smarter and didn't need the help.
And that's kind of that. Then what that did was that was a kind of social understanding of it. But because of the way the world works, that social understanding then re-permeated it back into professional understanding as well. So then professionals engage with that narrative as well, and then reinforce it when people come for diagnosis or support. And that's kind of how it's a vicious circle that just keeps going round and round.